I grew up in Durango and started hunting elk in the San Juans with my dad when I was a teenager. I know the country well enough to point to drainages on a map and tell you where the ice clings longest and where the cows like to feed when the first cold snaps roll through. Copper Ridge was always a quiet place to us, high, windy, and out of the way. You reach it by creeping up old mining roads that crumble at the edges and kick loose rock into the drop-offs. By mid-September, the aspen go gold, mornings bite at your ears, and the air at 11,000 feet feels clean in a way you only get in the high country. My buddy Eli and I had hunted that ridge for 3 years without anything worth talking about beyond normal elk stories. The fall of 2019 changed that. We left Durango before sunrise in my old F-250, a flatbed trailer hitched on with our gear strapped down, a wall tent, cots, a propane heater, coolers, and an ATV to reach glassing spots fast when the wind shifted. The climb from Silverton was slow, low range, steady throttle, tires slipping just enough to keep me honest. We passed one other truck coming down stacked with firewood and didn't see another soul the rest of the drive. By mid-morning we pulled into a small bench just below timberline, flat enough for a tent and close enough to water to be practical. You could stand there and see a broad face of the opposite slope. It broke into shelves of talus and brush with open strips of meadow running like ladders toward the top. We set camp, strung a line for wet gear, and took a minute to sit with coffee and look over the country. The first day was normal. We checked wind, glassed, and watched a line of cows slip out of the aspen groves near the top. A bull bugled once, thin across the valley. It was the kind of note that raises the hair on your arms, even if you've heard it 1,000 times. We cooked dinner on the stove, dehydrated beef stew that tasted better than it deserved, then stood with our binoculars on the edge of the bench while the sun pushed against the horizon and the sky went orange. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my glass had a smudge catching sunset, but when I lowered the binoculars, it was still there. A perfectly round metallic object floated above the far ridge. Not up in the clouds, above the slope itself, hard against the terrain like it was tied to it. It rotated slowly. No wobble, no flicker, no visible parts. The skin of it was mirror bright, and every few seconds, the sun slid along it like a blade. I handed the binoculars to Eli without saying a word. He went quiet for a long time, then said, "How is that not making a sound?" We tried to close the distance. We climbed straight uphill to a higher spur that would let us cut a little of the angle. The object kept its place from us. It never drifted closer or farther. If we gained elevation, it shifted in a way that kept the same gap, like a dog that won't let you within reach, but won't run off either. We pushed up hard enough to feel the thin air biting our lungs, and still couldn't get it any nearer. When the light went from orange to dark, the sphere slid behind the ridge and was gone. We stood there blinking in the gray until our eyes started to burn. Back at camp, we tried to talk it into being a drone. Eli does construction and knows mechanical noise. He shook his head and said, "I don't care how good the batteries are. That high in this wind without a sound, no chance." I didn't have a better idea, so I said nothing. The temperature dropped fast after midnight. The canvas of the wall tent went stiff as a board, and the little pops it made in the wind woke me even through the fatigue. I fell asleep again, and at some point a low tone rolled through my cot. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It came up through the ground and into my chest and made my teeth feel like they were touching a live wire. I sat up and felt the cot frame humming. Eli said, "You feel that?" I unzipped the flap and had to squint. The entire opposite ridge burned with an orange light. Not flames, no smoke, no movement like fire gives you. The glow brushed across the slope from one end to the other and filled the spaces between trees. I've never seen anything like it. It made the black spruces look like cutouts. At first, I thought the ground itself was hot, but there was no heat coming across the cold air, and the smell was just mountain night, sap, damp rock, and the dead ash of our little fire. The tone in the ground came and went in slow waves. It didn't match anything I knew. It wasn't a truck, wasn't a helicopter, wasn't a generator, wasn't weather. Then the figures appeared. 5 of them, small, silhouetted along a shelf near the top of the ridge. They moved out of the trees and onto the open slope in a straight line. I can still see it when I shut my eyes. Step pause. Step pause. No lights in their hands. No stumbling. Each of them had arms that hung lower than seemed right, and heads that looked too large for their bodies. They weren't big, under 5 feet I think, but the proportions were wrong enough that my brain kept trying to resize them. Eli put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed without saying a word. The 5 changed direction as one and crossed the shelf. The orange glow gave us perfect contrast, and yet there was nothing to hear. No gravel scuff, no branch snap. When they reached the edge of the shelf, they stopped in unison and turned their bodies toward our side of the valley. We froze. The tone rose, cut off, rose again, and then vanished. The light went out like someone pulled a plug. The ridge dropped back into total darkness. I strained to hear anything. A footfall, a radio, an engine starting on some far road. There was nothing. We sat up with rifles on our laps until the first time gray showed. That cold felt like the kind that sits inside you. We packed camp in minutes and didn't waste time with breakfast. I kept telling myself that daylight would let us see some physical proof of what we'd witnessed. A scorch mark, a truck, tracks. We climbed a little ways to the same spot we'd glassed from the night before and studied the shelf with the binoculars. All the same, brush, talus, and the thin line of trail used by elk and deer. No burned trees. No footprints big or small from where we stood. No reason for a ridge to glow like a lantern. It all looked exactly normal, and for some reason that made my hands shake more than the night had. We started down the road. The bench broke into a narrow path that side-hilled through talus and loose dirt. You had to watch each step or slide 50 yards before you could stop. We were 2 switchbacks below camp when I felt eyes on us. I turned and saw a dark shape going through the trees high above, pacing our movement. I told myself it was a shadow from a passing cloud and turned back to the trail. 10 minutes later, Eli touched my pack. He didn't need to say anything. I stopped and looked up again. Just inside the tree line, a shape moved the way a person moves when they don't want to be seen. Smooth, no wasted steps, staying behind cover. It kept pace for a bit, then was gone. Maybe it was elk. Maybe it was nothing. It didn't feel like either. Halfway to the truck, Eli said he needed a minute and leaned hard on his rifle like he might drop. His face had gone a kind of gray I associate with shock. I asked if he needed water. He said his skin felt hot from the inside, like he'd been standing too close to a fire, and the back of his neck buzzed. After a few minutes, it faded. He waved me off, caught his breath, and we kept going. We didn't talk much after that. The road opened wide enough for the ATV, but neither of us wanted to make noise or stop long enough to unload it. We let gravity do the work and reached the truck in the early afternoon. We drove to Silverton and parked on Green Street in front of a cafe we knew. We didn't go in. We just sat there with the engine ticking as it cooled. I told the story once, straight through the way I saw it. Eli said he saw the same with the exception that he thought the figures didn't just turn in our direction. He thought they aligned to us. I didn't argue. There wasn't any room in me for picking it apart by inches. We went to his brother's place at the edge of town. His brother guides up there and knows every trail and camp spot by heart. He listened without interrupting, then told us not to repeat it around locals if we wanted to avoid problems. People go missing in that country, he said, and folks don't like hearing reasons that don't fit in a report. Winter came early. Work kept us busy. I pushed the hunt to the back of my head and figured the clean mountain air and lack of sleep had gotten mixed up with our expectations of seeing something special up there. In January, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Eli never calls that early unless something is wrong. He said he'd gotten out of the shower and found a perfect circle on his left forearm. It was the size of a quarter. The skin was smooth, slightly lighter than the rest of his arm, like a scar that had already matured. No scab, no redness. He went to a clinic in Durango. The doctor asked the normal questions: chemical exposure, hot tools, a burn he didn't remember, anything that could have caused a clean ring like that. Eli told him no to everything. They took a look, shrugged, and said to keep an eye on it. The headaches started a week later, not daily, but hard when they came. He'd get a nosebleed with them now and then. He's not the type to overreact, but he called me after the second one and said, "I don't want to go back up there." I told him I didn't either, and we left it there. I couldn't stop thinking about the way that light soaked the slope, and the way the figures moved like they were tied to one another. I tried to counter it with practical things. I read about ball lightning. I read about odd temperature inversions. I tried to find a drone model that could do what we saw. None of it matched the silence, the ground tone, the precision of those 5 bodies, crossing a shelf like a group on a timed march. In March, Eli texted me a picture of his forearm. The circle hadn't changed. He'd decided to see a dermatologist. They scheduled a small procedure to remove the scar line and biopsy it. I asked if he wanted me there. He said yes. I drove him to the appointment and sat in the corner while they numbed his arm and cut out a neat ring. It was routine. The doctor said it looked like scar tissue and sent the sample off. A week later, the office called and told him what we already knew. It was a mature scar, no signs of infection, no pigment changes worth noting, nothing else to explain. The good news was simple. The headaches slowed down over the next month. Maybe the stress eased. Maybe time did the work. He still gets a nosebleed every once in a while if he's up high or pushing himself, but nothing like January. That spring, when tags opened again, I told Eli I wanted to put in for a lower unit and stick to country with more traffic. He agreed. We both said we were fine with never stepping foot on Copper Ridge again. I sold the ATV. He sold a few pieces of camp gear. We didn't make a big deal out of it. It felt like the right way to handle it. Quiet, clean, and final. In the years since, I've been asked why we didn't tell the Forest Service or the sheriff. The truth is, we did call a non-emergency line and left a message that amounted to strange lights, strange noise, 5 small figures seen at night across a valley. A deputy called back 2 days later and said he'd note it. No one followed up after that. I didn't expect them to. There's not a line in any report that would change what we saw or what it did to Eli. I still hunt, just not up that high, and not that far from roads. I don't sleep as easily in a tent as I used to. A hum in a refrigerator or a furnace blower starting in the middle of the night will make me sit up faster than it should. Sometimes on a calm evening, a certain shade of orange in the sky turns my stomach. I don't tell many people about it. If you're reading this because you're looking at maps and thinking about pushing past the last curve on an old mining road to get away from everyone, I understand. That's exactly why we went there. It's why we kept going back. If you see anything in the sky above that ridge, and it holds the same distance no matter how you climb, turn around. If the ground starts to hum and a light starts that doesn't belong to heat or flame or anything with a switch, get in your truck and go. If there are 5 small shapes moving in a line without light or sound, do not try to get a better look. We got away from that mountain. We're fine now. We changed how and where we hunt, and we're done with Copper Ridge. That's the end of it for us, and that's as much closure as I ever expect to have. I grew up in Reno. By 33, I was working construction and getting up before sunrise most days. My closest friend Luke fixed cars in a small shop off Keystone Avenue. We've known each other since high school. When the weather turns cold and the sky gets sharp and clear, we drive out to the desert and camp. It's not about hiking or fishing. We go for the quiet and the stars. Early November last year, we picked Lunar Crater National Natural Landmark because we'd heard the night sky out there makes Reno's look washed out. We wanted to see it once, then go home and talk about it for a month. We took my truck. We followed US 95 south, grabbed gas and a burger in Tonopah at sunset, and turned east on US 6. Past Warm Springs, the traffic dropped to almost nothing. The land opened up into a flat basin with low black hills and old craters that looked like they were dug out by machines. That was the whole draw for us. Open ground, no houses, no power lines, no noise, just cold air and stars. We turned off the highway at the sign for Lunar Crater and followed a gravel road until we saw a little pullout near a shallow dry wash. We were a mile or so from the main parking area. No other vehicles. No tire tracks that looked fresh. The wind wasn't moving. The temperature was dropping hard. It was one of those nights where you can see your breath even when you don't want to blow it. We set up a small fire ring with rocks. Luke brought a cheap grate for a couple of bratwursts. I backed the truck so the hood faced the open sky. The plan was simple. Eat, turn off the lights, lie on the hood while it was still warm, and watch. The silence out there wasn't the kind you notice in a city park. It was total. No dogs, no distant highway noise, not even a coyote. It made our voices sound too loud, so after a while we didn't talk much. By 10, the stars were stacked on top of each other. The Milky Way looked like smoke, except it wasn't moving. We lay on the hood with our jackets zipped to the neck, our beanies pulled down, and our boots crossed at the ankles. I remember thinking it was the clearest sky I'd ever seen. Then I saw a streak of light cut across the west and stop for half a second. It didn't trail off. It just stopped and winked out. I sat up. Luke sat up. "Meteor?" he said. We both knew meteors don't stop, but neither of us wanted to say anything else. We went back to watching. Maybe 20 minutes later, I noticed 3 faint points high above to the southeast. They looked like stars at first, except they were the wrong color. Not blue or white, more like a pale, steady white with no flicker. They were arranged in a perfect triangle. The kind of perfect that you can tell right away, edges that feel measured. I told Luke to look. He saw it and just breathed through his nose and nodded. We watched them for a long time. I don't know how long. Time changed a little out there. Our hood went cold. Frost started to dust the glass. The 3 lights didn't move. When they finally did, they moved together. The triangle slid east, rotated, and came back west, but the spacing didn't change. There was no sound, no jet rumble, no helicopter chop, not even the hiss you get with a light wind. It was like watching 3 thumbtacks on a piece of glass move under a steady hand. We kept our mouths shut because talking felt wrong. Then a column of white light dropped from high above and hit the desert floor about 3 football fields away. It didn't open like a spotlight. It snapped on, one thin, straight cylinder, white and hard-edged. Where it hit the ground, the soil turned orange and looked wet. Heat rolled across our faces like someone opened an oven. The light stayed on for maybe 3 seconds, then switched off. The night swallowed the area again, but the orange stayed for half a breath and faded to black. The air smelled like hot metal and something sweet and burned, like a wiring fire. We both slid off the hood at the same time. I reached in and turned the keys to kill the battery lights. Luke grabbed the small flashlight from the toolbox and kept it off. We stepped down the slope into the dry wash beside our camp and crouched low. The dirt down there was powder fine and cold. My forearms pressed into gravel. I could feel the edges through my jacket. We heard nothing for maybe a minute. Then shapes lifted off the ground near the place where the beam had hit. They rose slow, like they were weightless but careful. I counted 6. Each one was black, so black they took shape only when they passed in front of stars, and about the size of a motorcycle. They hovered inches above the ground. They weren't round. They weren't smooth. They had segmented plates that angled and shifted, like armor that could breathe. Jointed limbs hung under some of them. The limbs moved now and then, small adjustments that made no noise. They spread out over the flats in a methodical sweep. Some paused and tilted, then crept forward. I could feel a low thrum in my chest, not in my ears. It came and went as they shifted position. One of them angled our way. It paused over the lip of the wash. I held my breath until spots formed in my vision. It drifted a few feet to the side and moved on. My legs shook. Luke's hand was on my sleeve. He wasn't squeezing, just keeping contact, like you do when you're trying not to move. We stayed flat while those things worked the ground. Every once in a while, a fixed point in the sky, not one of the 3, sent another thin beam down a few hundred yards beyond the first spot. When the light hit, the ground glowed orange again and gave off that same metal-sweet smell. After each pass, one or two of the black craft would angle in that direction and hover over the fresh mark for a while, like they were checking it. Sometime near 3 in the morning, the larger triangle above us rotated again. I don't know how I know it was around 3, but I'd been watching the frost creep along the edge of my sleeve and filling the gaps in the wash, and it felt like hours had passed since midnight. The 6 smaller ones pulled back toward the first burn mark. They rose as one, not in a line, just in a tight group. They didn't bank or wobble. They climbed, paused, and then they were gone. The triangle above pulled in on itself. The 3 points drew together until there was 1 point, and then nothing. It was like someone turned off a switch. We didn't move for a long time after that. I could hear the tiny crunch of frost under my jacket when I shifted my elbow. My lips were numb. When we finally climbed out, the truck looked dusted in gray powder. The fire ring was intact but cold. We didn't talk. We got in the truck and rolled forward without turning on the headlights, then eased up over the lip of the wash and idled toward the spot where the first beam had hit. When I finally did turn on the lights, I felt sick. 3 black lines, each about a foot wide and maybe half an inch deep, ran perfectly straight from the first burn site out toward the horizon. They ran parallel. The soil wasn't just burned, it had cracked and turned glassy. You could see grains fused together like it had been under a torch. I stepped out, crouched, and touched it with my glove. Heat didn't come off it anymore, but the smell was still there, the same sweet metal smell that settles in your sinuses. We followed one of the lines by driving alongside it. It didn't curve around rocks or bushes. It went through them, and where it did, the edges of the plants were clean cut, like a saw had been taken to them at ground level. We drove until the light started to silver the far hills. The line continued out of sight in front of us, and when I looked back the other way, I couldn't see the end there either. We turned around and went back to our camp, threw our gear into the bed, and left the ring of rocks right where it sat. The drive back to Reno was quiet. We stopped in Tonopah for coffee just after the gas station opened. Luke washed his face in the bathroom and stared at the sink for a long time. I blurted out once, "We should call someone," and then I looked at the man behind the counter and kept my mouth shut. On the road north, the sun was bright and the sky was clean, and it all felt like morning after a bad dream, except the feeling in my chest hadn't gone anywhere. It sat there like a weight. We agreed, without really saying it, not to tell anyone, not our girlfriends, not our families, not the guys at work. We didn't take pictures. We didn't even text each other about it that week. We didn't have to. The look was enough. I slept with my bedroom blinds closed for the first time in months. 3 days later, a black helicopter flew low over my street in northwest Reno. Not glossy paint, flat. No markings I could see. It made one circle over my block and drifted north. About an hour later, Luke called me. He had a shop apartment then, a mile from the river. "A black helicopter just came over my place twice," he said. "You tell anyone?" I told him no. He didn't either. We both sat there on the phone, breathing into our speakers like idiots, trying to figure out how anyone would even know to look for us. We hadn't posted anything anywhere. We hadn't used a drone, a tracker, any of that stuff. We had just driven out, watched, and hidden. He moved to Oregon a few weeks after that. It wasn't because of what happened, at least that's what he said. A cousin had a line on a better job at a bigger shop near Bend, and he'd been thinking about it for months. I took a transfer with my company to a crew based out of St. George in southern Utah. More hours, more pay. I told myself those were the reasons. We still text sometimes about sports or work, but we don't camp together anymore. I go out for day hikes with my wife and our baby on weekends, but I don't sleep outside. If we're out late and the sky opens up, I keep my eyes on the road. I've been back to Nevada for holidays, and once I had to drive US 6 again for a delivery. I passed the sign for Lunar Crater and kept going. I told myself I didn't have time. I didn't want to check and find those lines gone, or worse, find them exactly how we left them. I don't need proof. I know what we saw. The 3 points, the beam, the heat, the smell, the small black craft hovering inches above the dirt, the lines running straight as a surveyor's dream. Here's the part I can't explain without sounding dramatic, and I know how this reads. I work with rebar and concrete. Luke turns bolts and rebuilds transmissions. We aren't the kind of guys who spin stories for attention. But there is a difference between reading about a strange light and watching a triangle of steady points slide across the sky without a sound. There is a difference between hearing about burn marks in the desert and kneeling over a line of fused soil that keeps going until the horizon swallows it. And there is a difference between telling yourself you're alone and watching something without rotors or wings hover like it's measuring the ground under your boots. I never saw those lights again. I look sometimes when the sky is clear and my daughter is asleep and I'm taking the trash out. I'll stand in the driveway and tilt my head back for 30 seconds. If anything up there holds still too long, I go back inside. Maybe that's weak. I don't care. Luke and I agreed on one last thing when we met for a beer the last time he was in Reno. We did the right thing by leaving it alone. We didn't dig for answers. We didn't go back with a shovel or a meter or whatever you'd buy for that kind of plan. We don't need to know who flew the helicopter or who was in it or whether they were looking for us or something else. We stayed out of the way. We're alive. That has to count. I'm writing this because I can't carry it by myself anymore, and because I think some part of me wanted to see if saying it out loud changes anything. It doesn't. It just makes my hands shake a little less. If you go out there this fall and lie on your hood to watch the sky, I hope you get what you came for: cold air, a clean view, a quiet night. I hope that's all you get. As for me, I'm done with desert nights. I traded my heavy sleeping bag to a neighbor and tossed the cheap grate we used for those bratwursts. My wife asked why, and I told her I was tired of packing it around. That was true. I'm tired. I'm also certain of what we saw. 3 lights in a perfect triangle, a white column melting soil, 6 black machines gliding inches above the ground, the lines running straight in threes, cutting through brush like a carpenter's saw, a helicopter over our homes a few days later. That's my ending. We were noticed. We got out. We changed our plans. And we never went back. I'm a wildlife biologist on a seasonal contract with the Forest Service and the University of Montana. In late September, I rented a small Forest Service cabin off Bear Creek, west of Victor in the Bitterroot National Forest. My job was to check migration paths as elk dropped out of the high country and to validate a set of collar pings from last fall. I brought a paper topo, a compass, a handheld GPS only for navigation logs, and a small thermal scope. There's no cell service in the canyon. The cabin is one room with a potbelly stove, a bunk, a table, and a woodpile under a lean-to. Water comes from the creek. The first 2 nights were normal. The 3rd night changed how I work. I packed in from the Bear Creek trailhead with a single load and reached the cabin by late afternoon. It sits on a bench above a bend in the creek, with a small meadow across the water. I flagged 2 short transects on my way in and marked the points in my book. I keep 2 sets of notes, one in the field book and a backup list of waypoints on the GPS. I cooked a simple meal, banked the stove, and walked out to the meadow for my first night sit. It was the kind of quiet you get in the shoulder season. No campers, no gunshots, no traffic once you lose the faint hum of US 93. I sat on a folding stool about 60 yards from the cabin with the creek in front of me and the slope rising across it. I glassed with the thermal around 10 p.m. and caught a group of elk moving north along the tree line. They glowed bright in the scope, steady and heavy. I logged the direction and time. I went to bed feeling like the week would be simple. Night 2, I did the same thing. Same stool, same angle, cooler air. The scope picked up elk again, and a fox near the gravel bar. Then, above the elk and a little upslope, I saw 3 shapes that were the size and height of people but showed up colder than the background. Not the blank look of sky or water, not a hot outline, just a colder patch with edges that held together even when I shifted the focus. They moved in a straight line, slow, like they were walking a contour line. I lowered the scope and raised it again. The elk were still bright. the valley wall red as a gray wash of heat. Those shapes stayed dark and crisp as if the slope were a screen, and someone cut out 3 holes and slid them along it. I know thermal can bounce off metal or water and give bad readings, so I tested it. I scanned the creek. The water was warmer than the air. I scanned a rock I'd stood on earlier. It read as cooler than the elk and warmer than the air, which made sense. I scanned the cabin chimney and got a hot tube of heat. The only things that didn't fit were those 3 dark figures. I wrote down the time and a rough bearing from my seat to where they were moving. I decided to check it by daylight. By the time I cleaned up, they faded out. Not drifted into the trees, not lost in the glare, gone. I looked for them again for another hour and saw nothing. When I went back inside, the stove had burned lower than I expected. I had banked it heavy. It wasn't strange enough to make a note, but I noticed. Day 3, I hiked the bearing straight up the slope. The ground showed nothing. No tracks, no broken twigs, no snag fibers that catch on clothing. I'm not saying I should have found prints on duff, but I expected some sign if 3 people walked a line across that slope. I ran a small soil thermometer into shaded ground and got a normal spread for late September. I went back to the cabin, wrote it up as no sign, ate, and set up for the dusk sit. A little after 9 p.m., the treetops above the south wall of the creek lit up with a soft blue pulse. It wasn't a flash like lightning. It was more like a heartbeat. Bright, dim, 3 times, each about 7 seconds long. No thunder, no wind shift. The creek kept the same pitch. The crickets cut out during the light and started again after like someone hit a switch. I don't have a better way to say it. I glanced at my handheld unit because I keep a location log for each observation, and the screen said I was nowhere near Bear Creek. It dropped me south of Sula by miles, then jumped to a point near Como Lake, then blinked back to a spot across the valley on the wrong side of the Bitterroot River. Altitude readings were off by hundreds of feet. I didn't save any of those points. I wrote the times and the obvious errors in the book and shut it off. I decided to walk a simple line toward a spur that should drop to the trail and confirm a landmark I knew. With a topo and a compass, the route should have taken 20 minutes. What I found instead were small mismatches, one side draw where there should have been 2, a boulder field replaced by a smooth bench, a cut snag I'd used as a marker gone as if it had never been cut. I checked my pace count. I should have been at the spur. The creek on my left told me I was too far north. I turned around to follow my own tracks back to the cabin and found a section where my footprints drifted off to the right for 20 yards, then rejoined my line. I had no memory of stepping off the line. The ground there was level and clean. It didn't add up. The blue light pulsed again, shorter and dimmer this time, and the hairs rose on my arms like when you stand too close to an old TV. No nausea, no headache, no high-pitched ring. It felt like the air had a charge for a few seconds and then went back to normal. I chose to return to the cabin. I set a straight bearing, tied a bit of flagging every 30 yards, and refused to look up from the compass for more than a few steps at a time. When I reached the creek bend by the cabin, the flagging behind me made a neat line in my headlamp beam. Everything looked normal until I got to the door. The latch on the outside was looped with my own cord. I keep the padlock and cord in a tobacco tin on a nail inside the cabin. The cord had been tied in a half hitch through the latch in a way I don't tie it. My key was still in my pocket. There were no pry marks, no scuffs. Inside, my field notes lay across the floor, open to the same 2 pages in each booklet. Headings and times for the last 2 nights. My food was out of the outside locker and arranged neatly on the table by type. Cans stacked by label. Packets in rows, jerky in a pile. The can opener was taken apart and set in a line like a diagram. The extra socks I keep under the bunk were folded in pairs. The coil of cord that belongs on a nail sat centered on the bed. The stove was cold even though I had banked it. I looked for simple answers, rodents, a prank, someone messing with me. There were no boot prints in the cabin, no tracked mud at the threshold. A thin film of ash on the stove lid showed a small smear like something brushed it without weight. Outside, the slab where the food locker sits had 3 narrow indentations in a triangle, 2 fingers deep. They were not boot prints or claw marks. I've seen tripod feet leave marks like that on soil. It looked like a tripod or something with 3 narrow feet had rested beside the slab for a moment. I put the food back in the locker and cursed at myself for letting my heart rate spike. I lit the stove, set the table against the door, and sat with my back to the wall with the hatchet within reach. I kept the lantern off and let my eyes adjust. I rested the thermal scope across my knees, but told myself I would not raise it unless I heard something I couldn't place. Time stretched in simple counts. 1:20 a.m., creak steady. 2:10, a faint hum that could have been wind around the stovepipe. 3 o'clock, the crickets started again. 4:30, a flash of blue through the chinks in the wall, quick, not a pulse, and then nothing. At first light I stepped out with the water bucket. The air was cold enough to crust the edges of the creek stones with frost. Across the creek, about 40 yards out and level with the treetops, something the size of a pickup slid parallel to the water. It had no visible blades, no exhaust, no lights. Its surface looked like wet stone. It did not bob. It held a level line, followed the curve of the creek for 3 seconds, rose, and cleared the ridge toward Blodgett. I stood with the bucket in my hand and watched it go until it disappeared over the ridge. The only sound in the canyon was the water. I spent 10 minutes fighting with the instinct to chase it. Everything I know about field work told me not to do that. I packed the essentials, wrote my initials and the date under the table, with a pencil arrow pointing toward the door, something simple a ranger might notice, and decided to walk out the long way. If the map felt wrong up high, the safest choice was to handrail the water downstream until I hit the lower trail and then the road. I kept to the west bank where I could, crossed on logs where the bank pinned me, and avoided blowdown by cutting around rock ribs. As the light got better, the land went back to making sense. A rock with bright mustard-colored lichens sat where I remembered it. A snag on the bench under the cliff had fresh woodpecker chips at its base. A gravel bar I'd used as a rest spot on day 1 was right where it should be. My pace count matched the topo. I didn't feel watched or chased or anything like that. I felt tired and focused on not making mistakes. By mid-morning, I hit the lower trail, then the trailhead, and flagged down a rancher in a flatbed on US 93. He gave me a ride into Victor without asking questions. I went straight to the district office in Hamilton and filed a simple report with a law enforcement officer and my supervisor. Navigation anomalies, interior disturbance at the cabin, unknown craft over the creek at dawn. I did not try to make it sound big. I stuck to times, places, and what I saw. I asked for an immediate transfer off solo backcountry work and onto a team project near Helena for the rest of the season. My supervisor didn't argue. The request was approved that afternoon. A week later, I went back to the cabin with the officer and another tech. We found my pencil arrow under the table, a restacked woodpile I hadn't touched, and nothing else that would help. No prints, no new marks, no sign on the slab. I boxed the thermal scope and sent it to the lab with a note about the cold signatures. It came back as functioning within spec. The GPS unit got the same verdict. In the office, the blue light in the craft made for a few quiet jokes from people who hadn't been there. I didn't bother to push. I had nothing that could stand up as proof beyond my notes, and my notes were only good to me. What did change was policy. My supervisor assigned a second person on all remote cabin details for the rest of the fall. I wrote a final line in my report and meant it. Unknown presence, non-aggressive sorting behavior. Navigation interference observed. Recommend pairs only. I kept working that season near Helena with a crew. I didn't sit alone above a creek for the rest of the year. I didn't go back to Bear Creek. I think about the way my food sat on the table, with all the labels facing the same direction. I think about the cord that was tied through my latch in a knot I don't use. I think about the 3 marks pressed into the soil like a tripod had stood beside the slab, while someone or something moved things around in the cabin without leaving a track. I think about the way the land didn't match the map for a few hours, and then it did. People who hear this want a big ending. They want me to find metal in the grass, or a print I can cast, or a melted patch of duff. That's not what happened. What happened was a set of small things that lined up too clean to ignore. The blue light in the trees, the GPS throwing me all over the valley, the cold shapes that moved like hikers but didn't register as heat, the quiet craft over the creek that held a steady line and rose over the ridge toward Blodgett without a sound. I ended it by leaving the way you're supposed to leave, on your feet, with your gear, and with enough daylight left to drive home. I turned in a report I could stand behind. I asked not to go alone anymore. They agreed. That was enough for me. I'm a long-haul driver based out of Sioux Falls. Every Wednesday night in the fall, I run a simple loop, I-90 west to Rapid City, swap trailers, then deadhead to Wall and turn back. When the interstate is slick or packed with semis, I take South Dakota 240 through Badlands National Park. It's the Badlands Loop Road. Quiet, 2 lanes, almost no traffic after dark. I know the grades at Cedar Pass and the safe pullouts by heart. I don't stop inside the park unless something's wrong. That's not superstition. It's just common sense when the temperature hangs in the low 20s and the wind is strong enough to push a trailer a foot sideways. That's where this happened, and I am writing it down as cleanly as I can. I left Murdo after topping off the tanks and rolled past Kadoka into a black, dry night. No moon, crisp air, steady crosswind pushing at the curtains. I took exit 131 toward interior. The park gate wasn't staffed. It rarely is after 10. I eased onto SD 240, kept the speed around 45, and let the engine hold the grade. The route through there is stitched into my head. Ben Rifle Visitor Center on the left, the pullout for Big Badlands Overlook, the downhill past the closed Cedar Pass Lodge, then the climb out. I've run it enough times to feel each dip in the steering wheel. Past the visitor center turn, a white light slid along my passenger side window line. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a tower. It was the color of a welding arc, but steady, and it kept pace with me like we were connected by a rod. Too slow for a plane, too smooth for a helicopter, too high and far for a drone. I tried to find a source, maybe a reflection off the mirror, maybe an aircraft training out of Ellsworth, but the angle didn't make sense. When I crested the hill by Cedar Pass and the road tilted downward, the light went out mid-glide. No fade. Just gone. I marked the spot in my head, near the Big Badlands Overlook sign, and kept rolling. I mentioned it over coffee in Wall. A local I recognized from earlier runs said people had been seeing weird animal behavior near the Cliff Shelf Nature Trail. He didn't push the topic. I didn't either. You hear things on night routes. If you chase everyone, your head fills with junk. I finished the swap, drove back east on I-90, and told myself I'd seen a reflection or a training run with unusual gear. 1 week later, same stop in Murdo, same plan. The only difference was a thin fringe of snow blown across the shoulders. I kept the speed lower to hold traction going up to Cedar Pass. I clicked the CB to 19, listened to clear air, then turned it down. I told myself to stop thinking about last week and focus on the grade. At almost the exact spot where the light had paced me, the dashboard flickered. Not a single bulb failing, everything dimmed at once. The blower fell silent. The CB spit raw static like tearing fabric. The gauges slid to 0. The engine hiccuped once, then died as if someone cut the feed. I coasted a few truck lengths and guided the rig into the gravel at the edge of the Big Badlands Overlook pullout. No other vehicles in sight, no distant headlights, just the wind hitting the trailer. Inside the cab, I could taste something like aluminum foil at the back of my tongue. The hair on my forearms stood up. I tried the starter. Nothing. The dome light was a dull ember. I set the parking brake, killed the key, and thumbed it again. Still nothing. Out past the ridges, a shape lowered into view, slow and steady. It had the size of a school bus, but flatter, more like an oval on its side. No blinking lights, no exhaust. The surface didn't shine, it drank light. It stopped a few feet above the grass. A rectangle opened underneath, and 3 figures dropped to the ground one after another. They weren't bulky. They were tall with narrow frames and long forearms that swung low. They took the center line and began walking toward me with that same even pace, neither fast nor cautious, just consistent. I locked both doors and grabbed my emergency flashlight from the door pocket. It's a bright one, made for wreck scenes. I aimed at the road and snapped it on. Inside the cab, the beam looked crisp. Outside the glass, the beam bent. It started straight, then drifted sideways like heat was pushing it, even though the wind was blowing across me, not ahead. I adjusted the angle. The light wouldn't go where I pointed. It slid off the figures and skated across the asphalt as if there was a layer between me and them. I pressed the horn. The sound went out but felt small. I hit the air horn. The blast rolled over the road and lost itself in the empty dark. The figures kept coming. I put my boot on the brake pedal out of habit, as if a glowing brake light would matter. I kept count the way you do when backing to a dock, distance as yardage, 80, 60, 40. They didn't weave, they didn't look around, they just tracked straight for my door. Headlights rose over the hill behind me, high beams on a lifted ranch pickup moving slow with a tow strap coiled on its front bumper. The instant the light from that truck swept the road, the shape out in the grass shot upward, not like a helicopter, not like a drone. It snapped to an angle and climbed without noise, shrinking to a dot I could barely see, and then nothing at all. The three figures were simply not there anymore. No sprint, no retreat. 1 second they were closing on me, the next the road was empty. The pickup eased up in front of my rig and clicked on its hazards. A heavy-set man in a canvas jacket stepped out, hat pulled low, glancing once at the sky, and then at me, like he had trained himself not to stare up too long. He knocked on my window. I cracked it. "You dead?" he asked. "Everything's dead," I said. "Starter won't even click." "Hook you and drag you to the visitor center," he said. "Flatter there." We didn't talk about what we both saw until we were rolling. He backed up, looped the strap from his hitch to my tow point, and pulled me off the grade in first gear. My CB was still pure static. His worked fine. We used hand signals and hazard flashes. 10 miles an hour felt reasonable given the surface. The night stayed empty behind us. At Ben Rifle Visitor Center, we unhooked in the lot. The wind pushed grit across the asphalt. I tried the key again. This time the starter clicked weakly and then went dead. The rancher leaned into my window. "Saw something with no lights lift off as I crested," he said. He didn't add anything more. I called my roadside service. A mobile tech drove out from Rapid City. He checked the alternator and said the output was normal. The batteries held charge once he jumped them. He pulled fuses and found the inline fuses on the CB were burned to a crisp. There was heat browning on the cokes near the radio mount, and a faint melt smell inside the dash cavity. He scanned the port and showed me a time-stamped log, voltage irregularity at the exact minute my truck died. No other faults. With the CB disconnected and a fresh main fuse, the truck started and idled like nothing had happened. We both looked at the sky. It was just night, clear, cold, open. The rancher shook my hand, said to keep my brights on if I had to be up there in November, and left. I drove 40 miles an hour to Wall, swapped trailers, and ran east on the interstate with the cab light on. I slept in the truck stop lot with the engine off but the dome on, which is something I never do. I told dispatch the next morning I wouldn't take the park route at night again. The guy on the other end said to write an incident report and bring in my receipts. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. In the afternoon, the mobile tech emailed the shop foreman about the cooked fuses and the diagnostic code, and the foreman forwarded me the screenshot. He has seen alternators fail, batteries crater, and amateur radio rigs burn up when wired wrong. He wrote that he hadn't seen a truck kill itself so cleanly and come back with only the radio fried. I took the rest of my day and drove back out in daylight. The rancher met me at the Cedar Pass turnoff in his pickup. We walked the shoulder by the Big Badlands Overlook pullout and scanned the frozen grass. There were 3 parallel compressions crossing the ditch, each a clean line through frost and dust, spaced the same, like 3 narrow sleds had traveled in formation. They led straight toward the spot where my rig had stopped and ended at the lip of the asphalt. There were no heel marks, no toe marks, no normal footprints with depth or slippage like you'd expect on frozen ground. We didn't stand there long. We marked it with our eyes, not our hands. The rancher said he'd had calves spook hard on that stretch in November a few times, and that he'd seen stuff lift when weather changed. He talked like a man who had already spent enough time wrestling with his own memory. I phoned Highway Patrol to register a disabled vehicle note from the night before. The operator confirmed they had an entry about a stalled semi east of Cedar Pass at the time I gave. That was me. She asked if I needed a tow. I said the truck was running. She told me to call back if I found debris or a hazard. I said I would and didn't mention anything else. Back in Sioux Falls, I pulled the CB out of the dash and capped the Cokes. I replaced my flashlight only because the experience made me not trust it anymore. I told dispatch I'd take a different weekly loop. It pays less. I took it anyway. Another driver runs the Badlands leg now. I didn't campaign to switch him. I didn't warn him beyond. Be careful at night by Cedar Pass. He smiled like drivers do when they hear a road story and said he'd be fine. The paper trail exists. My dispatch notes, the service ticket from Rapid City, the log with the voltage irregularity, the Highway Patrol entry. The rancher exists. He put a tow strap on my bumper and pulled me out of a dead patch and watched my truck start again after a jump. He saw something lift when he crested that hill. So did I. I haven't been back through SD 240 after dark. That's the change I made. I still drive. I still like the quiet hours when most of the country is asleep and the road belongs to a small set of us. But there's a stretch near Cedar Pass where the night feels wrong in a way I can't argue with. The fix was simple. Stop giving that place a chance to make choices for me. I know how stories like this sound. I've spent years listening to them in booths and on Channel 19 and at Fuel Islands. Most fall apart when you ask for places, times, repair tickets, or names. I can give all of that. The only thing I can't give you is the feeling that sat in my mouth when the cab died. That taste of metal, and the way the flashlight beam slid off target like the air had a seam I couldn't see. You either believe me or you don't. It won't change the route I take on Wednesdays. If you run that road at night in November, keep moving through the pullout by Big Badlands Overlook. If you have to stop, stop in the visitor center lot under the lights, and wait for a second vehicle to show on the hill before you try to crank again. And if a white light matches your speed along the window line, don't spend your attention on it. Watch the dash instead. If it flickers, you'll want to be as far from that shoulder as you can get. I learned that the hard way, so I could keep working with a clear head. That's my ending. I stayed in the job and stepped around the problem. I'm fine with that. I've been a hunting guide in the Ozark National Forest for close to 20 years. Most of my work sits in and around the Boston Mountains, where the ridges are steep, the hollows run narrow, and the creeks can jump their banks fast after a storm. I'm not a storyteller. I'm the guy who checks the wind, watches the sign, and gets clients in and out before lunch. I've dealt with feral hogs, lost hikers, and drunk road hunters with cheap spotlights. I thought I'd seen what this place could throw at me. That changed on a late October trip along Fall River. I didn't go back after that. I sold my place and moved east, and I don't guide in the Ozarks anymore. 2 clients booked me for a 3-day deer hunt, Walt and his nephew, Nate. They were from Little Rock. Walt was in his 50s, tall and sturdy, the kind of man who keeps his hair short and his tools clean. Nate was 21, lanky, still growing into his frame, eager but green. They wanted a quiet camp and an early start. I set us up near a bend in Fall River, down a rutted logging road past an area folks call Deer Lick Hollow. It's a few miles from the nearest pavement. No cabins, no houses, just oak and hickory, the river, and a tired old fire road that runs up a ridge like a scar. We reached the pull-off an hour before dark. The air had that late October bite, cold if you stand still too long. I parked the ATVs in some brush, and we carried gear to a flat spot above the water. I showed them where the game trail crossed the river and how the wind usually slid down the hollow overnight. We'd ease out before dawn and set up along a ridge face that holds heat on clear mornings. I'd done it the same way for years. While we unloaded, an old Chevy rolled down the logging road and slowed beside us. The driver was a white-haired man with a face like sun-dried leather. He didn't look surprised to see us. He nodded and kept his hands on the wheel. "You boys camping by the water?" he asked. "Just for the night," I said. "We'll be quiet." "Do what you want," he said. "Some nights it lights up down there. Better to be off the river when it does." He let that hang, then eased on. I figured he meant someone night fishing with lamps or kids messing around. I'd chased off spotlight crews before. You see the beams coming from a mile away. They bounce and swing, sloppy work. We set the tents and built a small fire. I like canvas for the cold months. Thick walls keep the heat in. We ate venison sausage and beans and talked about the plan. Walt listened and nodded. Nate asked a lot of questions. He was excited. I could tell he wanted to do everything right. As the sun dropped, the forest got quiet in a way I didn't like. Usually the river talks a little, or you get a chorus of crickets and tree frogs. There was sound, but it sat low, like the volume had been turned down across the board. An owl called once from the far side of the river and then stopped. No wind, no leaves moving. Our fire cracked and that was the loudest thing around. "It always this still?" Nate asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Cold nights can sit heavy in the hollows." We hung the food, raked the fire down to coals, and kept our boots by the tent flaps. I checked my watch, 9:30. I told them we'd turn in at 10 and be up at 4:30. Walt poured a little coffee from a thermos into metal cups. The steam looked bright in the firelight. That's when I felt it. Not a sound at first. A pressure. It started low in my chest, like someone had set a big generator a few hundred yards away and was slowly bringing it online. My cup vibrated on the cooler lid. I could feel it through my boots in the dirt more than I could hear it. "You hear that?" Walt asked. "I feel it," I said. The hum thickened but didn't climb in pitch. It was like the whole hollow caught the same note and held it. I stood and took a step toward the river. I wanted a look across the water. The far bank sits only 30 yards off our fire ring, but the trees make a tight wall. I had a headlamp around my neck and a flashlight at my belt. I didn't switch them on yet. It happened in a blink. No buildup. No arcs sweeping the trees. Just 4 tall, narrow columns of orange light standing between the trunks on the far bank. They weren't shining down from above. There was no beam cutting through the canopy. The columns just existed, like someone had unrolled them from the ground up. Each one was a little taller than the trees around it, and each had a defined edge you could see against the bark. They didn't flicker. They didn't sway. They gave off a warmth my skin could feel from across the water, like standing near a big space heater. "You see that?" Nate said, his voice thin. "I did see it. I just didn't know what to call it. I've seen plenty of illegal lighting rigs. Boys mount cheap LEDs on truck racks or build towers on four-wheelers. Those lights throw a cone. They flare on leaves and fog. This was none of that. These columns stood still for maybe 3 seconds, then slid sideways fast, keeping shape as they moved between the trees without bending around them. The hum deepened. I couldn't tell where it came from. It didn't feel like sky. It didn't feel like ground. It felt like it sat in the space between my ribs. "We're breaking camp," I said. "Right now. Rifles shouldered, headlamps off." "You think that's road hunters?" Walt asked. "If it is, it's the strangest rig I've ever seen," I said. "Don't point anything at them. Don't talk. We're leaving." We kicked dirt over the coals and swept up what we could. I carry a small get-out roll for times like this, essentials bundled tight. I strapped it to my pack and waved them toward the old fire road that angled uphill. The ATVs sat half a mile away along that track near a wide turnaround we use as a trailhead. I wanted distance between us and the river. We moved fast. The hum grew so thick that hearing felt like it lost detail. The crunch of our boots on leaves turned flat. I tried to say, "Watch your footing," and my own voice sounded far away to me. I've had my ears ring after a high-powered rifle goes off under a metal roof. This wasn't that. This was pressure without pain. The column slid again. 2 of them were on the far bank. 2 more flashed to our side of the river without crossing the water. 1 stood in the trees to our left. Another dropped into view ahead of us up the road and then vanished. When they moved, they didn't travel like a person would. There was no build-up or slowdown. 1 second they were in one place. The next second they were 20 yards over, the edges still clean. I kept us on the road, heads down, hands close to our chests. We didn't run yet. Running on that slope in the dark is a good way to break an ankle. I counted steps. I always do that when things go bad. It keeps the mind from flooding. At the 3rd switchback, we hit it. The spot I call the muffled zone now because I don't know a better term. The air felt heavy. Not cold at first, just thick. Our footfalls dulled. My breath sounded like I had a pillow over my face. I opened my mouth to breathe more air, but it didn't help. The pressure climbed. My sinuses ached like I'd dropped down a mountain too fast. Nate stumbled. Walt caught him under the arm. I reached back for the kid's pack to take the weight, and his shoulder jumped like a live wire hit him. He sucked air through his teeth and folded to his knees, then onto his side. His legs stiffened and kicked. His eyes rolled back to white. He made a choking sound that put ice in my gut. "On his side," I said, but my voice came out thin and useless. I got a hand under his head and pulled him to the safe position. His jaw clenched so hard I thought he'd break a tooth. He started to seize hard. I looked up and saw one of the columns slide through the trees off our right shoulder and stop 10 yards away. The edge of it hit Nate's boot and lower leg. The leather smoked like you held it near a hot stove. The light didn't cast a shadow. It wasn't even bright in the normal way. It made its own kind of daylight inside its edges and left the rest of the world dim. Walt reached for the kid and yanked his boot clear. His hand brushed the light. He hissed and shook it like he'd grabbed a hot pan. I saw a perfect circle on the back of his knuckle turn pink, then red. The hum pushed higher and I felt my molars vibrate. That broke something in me. I stopped thinking about what it was and started thinking about distance only. I slung my rifle across my back and grabbed Nate under the arms. Walt took his legs. We lifted him to a drag and moved. The road rose and got rockier. My thighs lit up with heat. Every time we turned, a column slid to block a line we could have taken off the road. They didn't close the last few feet. They just stood there like posts, making us choose another track. The muffled air stayed with us for 100 yards, maybe more. It's hard to measure time in that state. All I know is that the moment we crossed the wide flat that marks the trailhead clearing, the pressure fell away like a door had opened. The hum cut out. The night was plain again. The river sounded normal. Crickets returned. My own breath came into focus. The trailhead is a bare patch of clay with 2 big stumps and just enough room to turn a truck around if you're careful. Our ATVs sat side by side where we left them. I had keys in my chest pocket. My hands shook and I still got the first machine started clean. Walt kept hold of Nate's legs while I climbed on. Then he lifted Nate across the rack and hugged him from behind to keep him from sliding off. I got the second ATV going and jammed it into gear. We didn't talk, we didn't look back. We worked the throttles and let the engines climb. The machines thumped over ruts and slapped through small puddles. The road met a larger old forest route, then another, and then we were at the trucks. We loaded like we were practiced, which we were not. We were just fast. I stripped off my gloves and yanked Walt's door open. "Hospital," I said. I didn't have to say which one. Jasper was closer than Harrison. He nodded. We got Nate into the back seat with his feet propped and his head on my jacket. He was sweating hard but cold to touch. His jaw had loosened. He was breathing rough but steady. Walt drove. I followed. The tires hummed on the highway, and for a second that low noise made my stomach turn. We reached the emergency room, rolled Nate inside, and I let the nurses take over. They asked what happened. I said he seized in the woods and may have caught a small burn on the leg. I didn't say anything about lights. I could not make the words in my mouth match what we saw. They treated him for dehydration and stress, and something they called environmental exposure. They drew blood and gave him fluids. His temperature was low. That didn't make sense to me, but I kept quiet. The doctor asked if there were drugs involved. Walt said no. He was right. We had no booze, no pills, nothing. The kid came around slow. When he opened his eyes, they tracked normal. He didn't seem confused about who we were. He didn't remember the exact moment he fell. That's common with seizures. I've seen it once before in a different context. When the nurse rolled up his pant leg to check the burn, she made a face. A perfect ring, about the size of a quarter, sat on his left calf near the boot line. The skin had blistered in a clean circle, not ragged like a brush burn. There were smaller rings on the back of his neck under his hairline and along his forearm where his sleeve had ridden up. They looked like someone had pressed a hot metal washer to his skin and taken it away. The staff dressed the spots and told him to keep them clean and dry and watch for infection. I've seen bad burns. These weren't like that. The skin changed color fast. By the next day, the angry red faded to pink and then to a pale ring. No scabbing, no seepage, just healed marks that looked weeks old, not hours. We checked out of the hospital the following afternoon. Nate slept most of the drive back to Little Rock. He said his head throbbed and his stomach felt hollow, but he could keep food down. The rings itched. I told him not to scratch. We never called the sheriff. We never wrote a report. We never went back to the bend in Fall River to pick up what we left. I keep thinking about the old man in the Chevy and the way he said, "Some nights it lights up." I think about how sure he sounded and how he didn't push us to leave, like it wasn't his business. Maybe that's how it is out there. Everybody minds their own and lets the river keep its nights. Walt paid me in full and added more. I tried to refuse the extra. He said, "You got us out," and that was that. He asked me once in the parking lot what I thought it was. I told him I didn't know. He nodded like that answer sat fine with him. We shook hands, and he drove away. Here's what stayed with me, and I still can't sort it. Those columns didn't behave like anything tied to a normal source. There was no arc, no origin, no shadow from them, even when they stood close. They moved without crossing the space between. The hum sat in our bodies more than in the air. The muffled zone felt like stepping into a different pressure system, and the marks it left on skin healed wrong, too fast and too clean. I tried to sleep that night back at my place. Every time the refrigerator kicked on, I sat up, heart going. I walked the yard with a flashlight twice. I told myself I was checking the fence. That wasn't true. I was waiting to see orange between the trees. I didn't see it, but I knew I was done. The next morning I called a friend in the Ouachitas about a cabin he'd mentioned selling. By the end of the week we shook hands. I signed the papers on my Ozark spot 2 days later and let the buyer haul the trash from the shed. I left my deer racks in the garage and didn't look back. I didn't quit guiding. I still take folks out. But I don't camp near that river. I don't camp in any hollow that runs that cold and that quiet after dark. If a client asks for the Boston Mountains, I send them to another guide and tell them he's better suited for that terrain. If I pass Jasper on the way to see a buddy, I keep my eyes on the road and my radio off. People like a tidy ending with a label on it. I don't have one. I didn't chase those lights. I didn't measure anything. I don't claim a theory. I only know what happened to us in a place I used to trust with my eyes closed. We walked out with our lives, and that's enough. When I lock my new door at night and hear the HVAC hum, I take a breath and count to 10 and let it pass. I picture the wide flat at the trailhead and the way the sound stopped the second our boots hit that clay. I didn't need more of an answer than that to make a change. If you camp along Fall River and the night turns heavy and your chest starts to vibrate for no reason, don't wait and see. Pack what you can hold in one hand. Keep your voice low. Stay on the old road, even if your instincts tell you to cut into the trees. And if the woods light up in clean orange columns with no source and no shadow, don't stand there and try to name it. Put distance under your feet until the night sounds like itself again. Then go home. That's the only advice I've got. It's the only reason I'm still here to give it.